Welcome to Party Politics, where we prepare you for your next political conversation. I'm Jeronimo Cortina, professor at the University of Houston.
And I'm Brandon Rottinghaus, also professor here at the University of Houston. Obviously, politics gets a little bit crazy, and you know it's going to come up at the next dinner party or cocktail hour. So let's talk about all the things that are happening. The big news of the week, obviously, Jeronimo, is that Ken Paxton, the Attorney General of Texas, was acquitted on all charges during his impeachment trial. I want to get your reaction to this, and so we'll talk all about that in a few minutes. But first, some interesting stuff happening on the national level. So one of the big things of the week was that Mitt Romney, the senator from Utah, has decided not to seek a second term in the Senate. This is pretty stunning for all kinds of reasons, but he had a kind of, I think, a fairly, let's say he has a kind of nice way of exiting by saying basically that the party had been taken over by this populist messaging, not pointing at anyone in particular, but I think we all know who he's talking about. It's stunning to think that just a decade ago that he was the standard bearer of the party. Right? He was the nominee for president. True. It was like an ocean away. And now, as he says, there's this sort of new force in the Republican Party. So what did you kind of see and what did you sense when he announced he was retiring?
Well, I think he's, on the one hand, I think a lot of Republicans might be, and also Democrats, right, on both sides of the aisle, might be completely fed up. Yeah. And he's like, this is not what I signed for. Yes. End of story.
Hard not to blame them for
exactly.
that.
That's one point, and I think that's the point, right? It's very hard to fight the tide on the one hand, especially when you are fighting people that perhaps in his or their view they don't want to sit down and talk about these issues. Yeah. And then on the other hand, he said, look, I'm 70-something. I'm tired. I'm old. It's time for the new generation of leaders to come in because they're going to be making the decisions that eventually is going to affect their lives. Yeah. So I think that also sends wink to some members of Congress.
He's looking, around the room.
Executive branch as well, saying guys, I think it's time for us to go retire and leave it to the younger generation.
I thought you had to be 80 to be in the Senate. Oh. I'm sorry, I misinterpreted what the prevailing norm was. No. Yeah, he's retiring before he's 80. Yeah, a wink and a nod. I think that's interesting, and I like your point that he's doing what he thinks is best here. But the problem is that he is then going to continue to exacerbate those problems, right? If the problem is that you don't have senators who are going to kind of be in the room, who are going to try to work towards compromise, and you leave it to people who are going to come next, I don't think that we're in a generation where the next is going to be more willing to compromise, right? And in fact, probably just the opposite. Utah's a little different. They tend to elect people who aren't quite so ideologically rigid, but you just never know, right? Yeah. In the Republican Party these days, there's a chance that could happen. And to be honest, in the Democratic Party too. One of the things he actually said too, or that was rather reported after he said this, was that they had floated the idea of running as a third party with Joe Manchin. What do you think about that? And this is really the kind of the heightened notion of how dysfunctional Washington is. We're going to totally reject the party system and run on our own, right? Yeah. So would it work?
No.
Okay, good.
Next question.
Yeah. I mean, as political scientists, we're loath to see how third parties can function in this country, right? Even though other countries, of course, they function quite well. But it's really a long shot at that point, even with the notoriety of Joe Manchin and Mitt Romney.
Well, and you would need the Ross Perot kind of money to have or make a dent in the Electoral College.
The Andrew Yang kind of money. And or the Pierre Delecto kind of money. Do you remember this? So Mitt Romney had an alternate account on Twitter for a while named Pierre Delecto. It was discovered. I can't remember how it was discovered, but that's going to be my favorite memory. Right. And actually, too, if you haven't seen it, in Netflix, the documentary Mitt, which is about his run in 2012, makes him look like a really good person. So I think that's the kind of thing we should have and celebrate in politics, right? People who are good and who are committed to their ideals and willing to work with the other side. hopefully we're going to get somebody, knock on wood, that's going to be like that. But we shall see. But speaking of politics, actually here in Texas, Ron DeSantis, who's the governor of Florida running for president, is going to be in Texas on a 3-day fundraising trip. Some of the notable people involved in this include Chip Roy and Lamar Smith, 2 members of Congress who have been sort of vocal against Donald Trump. So back to the Texas ATM. He's raised a fair amount of money in Texas, about $2 million last time he was here. So we're likely to see probably him pull a little bit more. But is this going to help his standing in Texas at all? What do you think?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to say on the one hand, especially given that, former President Trump has such a big, or as he would say, bigly lead.
Huge.
On the other Republican contenders for the primary. It's hard to say on that. On that. What it strikes me of the DeSantis visit is that allegedly his campaign is having some financial difficulties.
Mm-hmm.
So coming to Texas to, replenish
Cash
the coffers is a very good idea.
Just a big bag with a dollar sign
exactly.
on it.
And also to talk about the border, right? To talk about immigration. So when you put those things together, maybe it's a signal that the campaign is not doing as well as everybody thought that it would be doing by this time, and especially the big lead. So, for DeSantis to, try to narrow that lead with Trump, he would need a lot of red meat on the one hand, right? Going to the right of Trump on many issues. And on the other one, he would need an insane amount of money.
Yes, that's a good point. Or a Trump implosion. And I think every member right now who's running is thinking about this idea, right? And we'll talk about this next week when there's a presidential debate on the Republican side and get a sense of kind of how they're trying to position this. But I think they're all kind of waiting for the Trump implosion. It may not come, right? It may be that he's able to survive this. But if you look at some of the polling in Texas here, strong Republicans believe Trump should run, 64% of them, which is not a lot. Not as much as you'd think, but people who are very strong Republicans or lean Republicans, for only 48% say he should run in 2024. So there's some waning support for Trump, I think, and it's soft enough that if he does continue to move on this, that it could be troublesome for him. So we'll see how that plays out. That's a very big story and lots of question marks, but obviously relates to a similar matter that Hunter Biden finds himself in. This is the president's son. He was indicted this week on gun charges, setting up a trial that is going to loom over the 2024 election. This is interesting because it's the first time we've seen a sitting president's child face criminal prosecution. First son. Yeah. Interesting. So it's interesting. I think that the problem for Democrats is that they're going to kind of have this equivalency problem on their hands, right? Where on one hand you've got Donald Trump and all of his legal problems, but then you could have a kind of counterbalance to that, where the narrative is that, well, Joe Biden has his own legal problems, right? And so that equivalency could be really complicated, right? It's not as clean, I think, as Democrats would have hoped. And I think Democrats are trying to push back on that narrative that they're the same, right? Like, we are not the same. But obviously there's going to be some muddying of that. So as a political matter, this is going to be really, I think, a game changer for the Trump campaign. What do you think?
Unless, right? I mean, I understand the equivalency problem, but unless, the Biden administration takes a, no hands, nothing, whatever approach, right? And lets the Department of Justice and plays out this trial. And he gets, perhaps, convicted.
Jail
That's,
time.
At least in some instances, right? The maximum prison time is around 25 years. Most of the times they don't get that. Some of the times they get not even prison time. So if he's found guilty and then no prison time, that's a disaster, right, for the Biden administration.
I see what you mean. Yeah, it's like you're protecting your son.
Exactly. If he gets some jail time, it would be, well, yes, et cetera, and it would have to be, basically the same jail time that, normal Joe would get.
Right.
So
not named Biden, a normal Joe, not named Biden.
So, I mean, it's complicated, but I think that if the Biden administration, and so far the Biden administration has signaled, like,
we're going to keep our hands off of this. Yeah,
that's not the problem of the administration.
Yeah.
It's his problem as he's worried, so on and so forth, as every single person would be.
Yeah.
But, they're not going to intervene.
Yeah.
Talk to his lawyer.
It would be just like my kids to get indicted while I was president, right?
Right.
Just again, like they're just, constantly trying to make my life harder. I don't like it. But actually, it's funny because this is not the only time we've seen presidential family in trouble. I was reading Jonathan Alter's book on Jimmy Carter, which is a really great book, but he talks a lot about Billy Carter, who was the president's brother at that point. And Billy Carter had all kinds of different business interests. He eventually got hauled in front of Congress to testify about like lobbying on behalf of Libya. He also made Billy Beer. Remember Billy Beer? It was like some of our listeners may remember Billy Beer. That was so bad that apparently Billy Carter would like empty the Billy Beer and fill the can with vodka instead. So there's definitely a long legacy to this. But scandals are all around us.
Yep.
And I have done a lot of research on this, and we've talked a lot about this. But another one came up this week, which was sort of bizarre and maybe just sort of on brand for Washington these days. And that was that Lauren Boebert, who is a member of Congress from Colorado, was kicked out of Beetlejuice for causing a disruption. We're a family station, so I won't get into the details about what was happening. I'm sure people have seen the specific evidence, like after this show, like Sesame Street's on and Wild Kratts is on. So we won't talk about exactly what happened, but suffice it to say that she embarrassed herself. Is it going to matter at all in the body politic here?
Let me think for a second.
Do we need to take a break and then contemplate?
Yeah. My answer is no.
Probably not. Right?
No.
Yeah.
Zero.
Okay, so why not? Like, what's the reason that these scandals don't have the kind of impact they do? Even the Hunter Biden scandal, where legitimately there's a crime committed potentially, and this means, as you said, jail time if he's convicted. This is something that you would assume is a serious thing, but it never ends up being that way.
Correct.
Why?
Well, first of all, we don't live in the 1980s anymore.
I do.
Well, I know you do. But the problem is, I think, is voters have a very, 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 very short memory span. So, that's it.
Yeah.
The news cycle also plays a very important role, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it was Boebert, it was Hunter Biden, et cetera, et cetera. Tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
There's a new scandal.
That's a good point.
And
Ken Paxton and then Donald Trump,
exactly.
and then you forgot all about what happened.
Exactly. I mean, he's over and over and over and over and
Yeah.
over. So people cannot digest, what are the implications? Should, the president's son X, Y, or Z? Should a member of Congress, Boebert, do X, Y, or Z? Is it bad? Is it good? Whatever.
Yeah.
And immediately after that, her campaign manager already, flipped the narrative, right? And maybe this is going to add points to her constituency.
That's actually a great point. It literally is a plus in some cases, right? Like you're able to fundraise off this. You can rally the base by saying, I'm being prosecuted by like the media, right, who have turned against me. And, I'm the one true champion here. And even though I didn't live up to my own standards, like, there should be, sort of more accountability and then move on, right? Yeah,
exactly.
And so I think, rising partisanship, increasing affective partisanship where we don't like the other side just because they're the other side. All these things are contributing to this problem where scandals don't matter like they used to. So it's certainly the case that these things will have an effect on 2024 for her because she definitely is in a very swingable seat, and for Hunter Biden because obviously it's such a big issue, right?
Correct.
And it has to be something they talk about. And I think the equivalency thing for them is going to be really telling. So we'll see how it plays as we go. This is Party Politics. I'm Brandon. This is Jeronimo. Let's talk Texas because there's a bunch of stuff going on with Ken Paxton, which we'll get to in just one second. But I want to bring up something from Harris County first. The county judge, Lina Hidalgo, has sought treatment for clinical depression. She's been out of the office for a couple of months. She says that her return date is going to be October 2nd, which is after the upcoming commissioner vote on the tax rate and the budget for the upcoming fiscal year. Alex Mueller, who was her opponent in the 2022 election, wrote an op-ed in the Houston Chronicle saying effectively that she should return or resign, that the county needs full-time leadership. She applauded her for receiving treatment, but then also quickly transitioned to say that there are all these problems in Harris County that have to be dealt with. We need a full-time county judge. What do you make of this? We've talked about kind of her the judge stepping away to seek treatment and the politics around it. Now things are heating up in a different way, or are they? I mean, are we at the same point still, and this is just kind of armchair quarterbacking, or is this a real concern that needs to be dealt with?
Well, so just to give a little bit of context, so Hidalgo won her re-election bid with less than 2% of the votes. That's around 18,000 votes, right?
Really
over a million.
Close.
Then, she conceded, and that was the end of story. Then she decided, well, no, the election was not clean, et cetera, and you got into these, whatever it is, right? In terms of the operation, when we talked about this a couple of months, I remember that we both said that, these big institutions like cities, counties, states, et cetera, are machineries that are pushed by, Harris County employees.
Yeah.
Everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
The county judge is not going to supervise, right, whether the power pump water thingy, right, is missing a bolt.
Checking the tread on the tires.
Right,
and,
exactly.
Doing the math on the budget. Right. Yeah, it's like she basically oversees all of these things.
Exactly. But overseeing, right, it's more like in terms of a different dynamic, right, from a public administration point of view. Also, you have, right, a commissioner's court.
Yeah.
So it's not that the county judge is the one that is doing this, and that. So more than is a question in my mind in terms of real public administration, because, the counties, county government still works.
Yeah.
It has its own big problems, right? But it still works. It's not Armageddon. It's not Mad Max or anything like that. So I think that this is a new way of starting the conversation, looking for not conversation, but starting the punches, right? A little before the election.
Yeah.
So there's no loss in terms of being politically relevant.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Like a blip in this is not going to affect the county's trajectory. Yeah. And so then you read this as being kind of political. There's probably something to that, right? And a lot of the, commissioners push back on this. Commissioner Adrian Garcia said that, Mueller was a failed candidate, an election denier. That's something that's an ongoing litigation. And obviously, you hate to see this spill over in a way that it has, but I think it just shows you that the politics of this are rough, right? Yeah. And Texas politics is a full contact sport, and we're seeing it here. And despite the fact that the county judge needs this treatment, she's still getting kind of political arrows shot into her. So I think it's too bad that it's come to this, but I guess it's not surprising that we're here, right? Politics can be pretty rough and tumble. And it's funny to see how far Harris County has come. I mean, it was the case for a long time that this was not a partisan position. No one really treated it like that.
Yeah.
Ed Emmett didn't even have an opponent, in the time before he lost to Judge Hidalgo. So it's something that has ratcheted up very quickly and probably following these big national trends in terms of partisanship. So it's not surprising that this has come to it, but it's sort of sad to see it play out as it has. Speaking of partisanship, the rule of law and everything in between, the big news, Jeronimo, of the week is the finality of the impeachment saga of Ken Paxton. So people who have not been paying attention, Ken Paxton is the Attorney General. He was impeached by the House of Representatives by a healthy margin. The articles, 20 of them were sent over to the Senate. The Senate had to hear them. There is a lot of testimony in the last 2 weeks, lots of political churn. You've got, outside groups who are making, kind of an attempt to try to sway the vote. Give me your sense of your surprise or not at the verdict here, where he is found essentially to be not guilty. He is acquitted on all of the charges. What do you think?
Well, I mean,
Were you surprised?
I was surprised right after, right, when Lieutenant Governor Patrick, really told what he thought about the process, right?
Yes.
And then
he didn't tell. He preached.
Right.
Right. It was more than just like, let me just like articulate this for you. It was pretty vocal. Yeah.
Yes. So to me, that was what really, really struck me. I mean, I don't know. Obviously, I'm not a senator. I'm not the lieutenant governor. So, the nitty gritties, I followed the trial, so on and so forth. But obviously, I didn't have access to any of the documents or anything like that. So I have no idea whether yes or no or whatever. What's clear is that, the evidence presented was very serious allegations, right? Extremely serious allegations, whether not or yes or not. And the way that it was presented by the defense, it was like, this is just, partisanship. This is against something that Democrats and Republicans in name only, a.k.a. rhinos, are pushing. Is a travesty, is just illegal, et cetera, right? All these whistleblowers are disloyal. They have their own agenda, et cetera. So that's, you agree that's basically how they sum it up.
Yes.
And then on the other hand, the prosecution is like, no, this is abuse of office, corruption. These are conservatives that are, just outing out the attorney general because he did something wrong.
Yeah.
That was basically, in a nutshell, the argument, right?
Yeah, I guess I wasn't surprised. I thought there were a couple of articles he was vulnerable on, the one about the whistleblowers and then some of the bribery stuff, maybe. There was a lot of smoke, not a lot of fire. There was no smoking gun. And I think, although they had the huge document dump a few weeks ago, it looked like there was just a ton of stuff there. And sifting through it, you could piece together a case. But it seemed like they just didn't get the outrage factor that they wanted. The House wanted to say, look at all of this evidence. The bulk of it implies he's doing something wrong on a bunch of different things. But it didn't work. And why exactly it didn't work, it's hard to predict precisely. But partisanship is a heck of a drug.
Yeah.
I mean, we found this out when we talked about Lauren Boebert and when we talked about Hunter Biden. Two of the Republicans who voted for impeachment aren't up to re-election until 2026. It's very likely that Kelly Hancock from North Texas probably won't run again. So he had, in some sense, a free vote. So their kind of ability to sort of maneuver around the politics of this is pretty high. Of the four who consistently voted with the attorney general, four of them are up for re-election in 2024. So, I mean, as political scientists, you would say that it's not causation, but certainly there's a strong relationship here.
Okay, so let me ask you a question.
Yes.
Right? So, given that, yes, I agree, there was not, the body was not there, the gun was not there, the casings were not there, right? So does Lieutenant Governor Patrick has a point or not?
Yes, I think he does. I think that the House didn't make as clean a case as they could have. And obviously, there's a lot of debate about whether or not they should have waited, right? Other impeachments, as Dan Patrick said, have taken a little longer. That's all true. So it's possible that they could have waited. Look, I mean, Ken Paxton has got criminal charges against him, right, on the securities fraud case. He's got an FBI investigation ongoing on bribery. The feds have got resources to dig. They ask questions. There are all kinds of opportunities for them to find more data, find more evidence. And the House didn't really do that. Is there more out there? I don't know. But if there is and the House didn't find it, then it will make it look like they rushed it and didn't get the person they needed. And that's, I don't, that's not prosecutorial misconduct, but certainly a violation of your kind of ability as a strong prosecutor to get your person convicted. But I actually think more than that the die was cast when the rules were set. And the reason I think that is because they had a high standard to meet. The criminal standard was beyond a reasonable doubt. And anybody can hide behind that, right? Because for any person, they can say, well, it didn't prove the case, right? 100%.
Right.
And so that's a high standard to meet. That's not a standard we're used to seeing in impeachments, right? For instance, in South Dakota, when they impeached their attorney general for killing someone with his car, now that person pled guilty to misdemeanors, but they convicted him. They removed him from office at a very lower standard than that. And so the evidence was higher and the standard was lower. So he left, whereas Ken Paxton didn't. The trial was short. You had 2 weeks of a trial. That's pretty short, right?
Yeah.
You had, the number of senators not change, right? Angela Paxton, take her out. She can't be part of it, right? Obviously, for good reasons. I'm glad they did that. That's a fair thing to do. Yeah. But they didn't change the math in terms of then what the number was required to convict, right?
Right.
And so as a result, that they still had to have more people, right? More senators to convict, and that probably wasn't going to happen. So all these things together basically set up the rules so that they weren't able to get a conviction, or it was going to be really hard to get a conviction.
Correct.
And I think, although you don't blame Dan Patrick for that, since the whole Senate voted on these rules, some of this was baked in.
Right. No, I understand, and perhaps the House rush or not, that's a question for the history books.
True.
And eventually we'll know a little bit better. Also, what is very interesting is that now the schism between the House and the Senate, if it was big, now is huge. So buckle up, right?
It's like pouring gas on a raging fire, right? There's already personal differences between the House and Senate, Phelan and Patrick, and now they've got to go into a special session where the parties are already divided. Yikes.
Yeah.
It's going to be a recipe for gridlock. I think they're going to get something done, right? I do think that every Republican recognizes this is a big issue. Dan Patrick wants to see it happen. Phelan put together a special committee for it. The governor, who's going to have to referee all this, has been pushing for it. So I think they're going to get something. Exactly what? I don't know.
Okay. And last question, very quickly.
Yes.
What happens, right, is there a GOP in-house knife fight?
I hope so. I think we should do like some kind of a cage match or something. I think that's the only way to solve this, right? The GOP has been warring since the early 2000s. This is not going to be something new, but I think you're going to see something from this. It's just exactly what and how we don't know. The speaker's not going to resign. Lieutenant Governor Patrick is too powerful in the Republican Party, so it's just going to be more of the same. Yeah, so buckle up.
We'll see. And we're going to talk about these and many other issues next week. I'm Jeronimo Cortina.
And I'm Brandon Rottinghaus. The conversation keeps up next week.